Welcome back, everyone. We're going to finish up chapter 19, talking about 19.3 and the evidence for evolution. So we're going to start off with something that allows us to really understand the age of different things, especially as we're talking about fossils that we find. And this allows us to kind of place everything on our discoveries on a timeline. So radiometric dating, and this is used to date rocks, but also the fossils that we'll find in the fossil record. And what it does is it basically compares the amount of isotopes, we'll talk more about that next unit, to its decay product. So basically, these isotopes, or different versions of atoms, decay or lose energy at a constant rate. And so if we can see the type of atom it is and how many particles and how much energy it has lost over time, we can establish how old that is. And if we know how old it is, we can tell when it formed. So this is going to establish a chronological history of Earth, and it's going to establish Earth's age at roughly 4.543 billion years. So 4.5 billion years. That's a lot of time through which evolution has taken place. Now, admittedly, not all of that we've had life, but still a long time we're dealing with. And when we're thinking about time, it's really important to think about things in geologic time. It's so easy to think about things in like a human lifespan, and evolution doesn't really take place in that time frame for large organisms like humans. We've got to think in huge geologic time periods. So one giant piece of evolutionary evidence is our fossil record. So we're able to establish the history of life on Earth. However, it's also important to note that not everything's going to fossilize. So it gives us a pretty fragmented view of life on Earth. It depends greatly on what the organism was made out of, how big the organism was, and also where it died. Certain types of places where you fall, it's more likely to fossilize versus others. But this gives us a good record of plants and animals that aren't around anymore, but we have evidence that they lived at one time. So we can see that there are changes. It hasn't been static. And one thing that fossils allow us to do is compare anatomical structures. And this allows us to track evolutionary progress. You may have heard of the phrase like hunting for a missing link, that one piece of evidence that's going to connect humans to apes. And there is a lot of connecting steps of non-humans, so there's not really ever one missing link. But as you can see in this image here, we have the history of dolphins, and dolphins breathe through a blowhole, which is located right on their forehead between their eyes. But if we go back in time through evolutionary history, through those fossils, you can see that the nostrils used to be further forward on the snout and then all the way towards the front of the snout. Like most terrestrial mammals have our noses at the front of our nostrils at the front of our snout. And so it gives credence to the idea that dolphins evolved from land mammals. So organisms evolved out of the sea onto land, and then a few went back to the sea, like dolphins and whales. And like I mentioned before, it's really important to watch assumptions from the fossil record. There's going to be huge gaps because not all tissue is fossilized. So if you don't have bones or a really nice calcified exoskeleton structure, it's really hard to be fossilized. And not all tissue is fossilized. So like with dinosaurs, we're not just now discovering that they were in reality probably very colorful, probably very feathered, had a lot of soft tissue features that aren't present in a skeleton, so we wouldn't have known. And I think a great example of this is if we gave the same treatment that we gave to our understanding of dinosaurs from just dinosaur bones to creatures like swans or baboons, they come out looking pretty terrifying. So it's probable that dinosaurs weren't as menacing as maybe we're led to believe from the Jurassic Park movies. And so maybe the noble T-Rex looked a little bit more like this bird here. Joking aside, there's a lot of other great pieces of evidence as we leave the fossil record. And one of them is vestigial structures. So we're going to look at anatomical evidence in living creatures today. So not the past, but present animals and clues that we can find. So vestigial structures, these are structures that aren't really useful or maybe have lost their primary purpose. So they had a stronger purpose in the past and are no longer serving as good of a purpose. So for example, whales have leg bones in the very back of their bodies, but they don't have legs anymore. And so this shows that at one time whales may have been quadrupedal organisms, and as those leg bones are no longer needed, they've shriveled up, but the genes are still there in their genetic code from their history as a quadrupedal animal, that they're producing them in the embryology or the embryo state. And humans have a whole bunch. I showed goosebumps on the back slide, but there's a lot of different things like a tailbone and ear muscles that are present in humans. Homologous structures are a great example of divergent evolution. And when we say divergent, we mean radiating or spreading out. And so these are similar structures that are present in diverse species, but may have a different purpose. So this indicates a common ancestry. So if we look through all mammals, the forelimb always has the same exact bone structure. So you can find a humerus, a radius, an ulna, those wrist carpals, the hand metacarpals, and the finger phalanges. If we look at things like dogs and cats and horses, that forelimb looks exactly the same. Flippered animals like dolphins, whales, and seals, bone structure, the bones look a little bit different. They may have a different function of swimming versus walking versus grabbing versus in the bat flying, but the bone structure is the exact same. So this is divergent, or we start with one structure and start to spread away from each other as we become different species in our evolutionary tree. Analogous structures are kind of the opposite. These are structures that have the exact same purpose. So last time it was different purpose, same structure. Now we have same purpose, but different structure. And so this is due to the those selective forces that we talked about in ecology. So things like competition, things like predation. There's similar needs or similar selective forces in their respective environments that led to similar traits, but from totally different evolutionary lineages. So well after the branch that became insects and the branch that became birds split, wings developed. So this wasn't the ancestor had wings and they both spread out from there. They spread out and then they converged together by both having wings. So this is convergent evolution, where we see different lines of evolutionary history coming together with similar traits. So like a wing in a bird, a wing in a butterfly, built totally differently, but both give flight. Another great source of evidence for evolution and common ancestry is embryology. So if we look at the embryos of totally different species, so not just talking about mammals here, but birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish, the basic embryo, so when an egg is fertilized and it starts to develop, looks very similar. And it's because all of these organisms evolved from a common ancestor that lived in the ocean. And so when you can see that that basic formation is very similar from the start, you can see that a lot of those genes are the same. The genes that are coding for the initial building of the organism were all the same. And so it looks very similar. It's that same basic format. And you can see in certain organisms like us, the human, we had a nice tail as an embryo, but that started to go away. So that's our vestigial structure there. If you look in the zoom in at the biochemical structure, you can see more similarities. So remember, our genes code for proteins. And if you look at proteins, there's a lot of similarities. So here's an example of dehydrogenase, the human protein of it, the spinach protein of it, the E. coli, it's the exact same protein. And so this implies that our common ancestor needed this protein, needed this trait, and it was so important that as we radiated out in the tree of life, there was no point in changing it. We kept it the same. Similar metabolic pathways. So glycolysis, which we'll learn about later in the year, every cell on the planet does glycolysis. This is a way of extracting ATP or energy from sugar. Every single organism on the planet does glycolysis. And so this implies that our common ancestor, the common ancestor of all life, this was the system they used. Nothing better has come along since to give a selective advantage. And so we're all still using it. I mean, we use other things as well, but this is the starting point. Cell morphology. All animal cells look very similar and have the exact same organelles. Well, not the exact same, but for all intents and purposes. Same with plants. Cells look very similar and have a lot of the same organelles. So these are built by genes. Genes are coding for the same stuff. And so when we look at the DNA of organisms, we're going to see that the closer they're related, the more similar their DNA will be. The more differences in their DNA, the more different they are. And so what kind of differences are we talking about? Well, we have about 96% of the same exact genes as chimpanzees. If anyone's called you a chicken, they're about 70% right, because you share about 70% of your genetic code with chickens. And you're all half bananas too. Half of your genetic code is the same as bananas. So how can this be? What are these genes we share? Well, that's what we're talking about here. Building these cells. We have a nucleus, same as a banana. We have vacuoles, same as a banana. We have mitochondria, same as a banana. We have endoplasmic reticulum, same as a banana in our cells. So these are proteins that we have that are the same. The pathway, all the enzymes we need for carrying out glycolysis, it's the same pathway. We need the same enzymes. Similar proteins, we need the same genes to make the same protein. So these are the genes we're talking about when I say that they're the exact same. So here's all our evidence showing that we have common ancestors. And if we have common ancestors, that means the only way that life could have radiated out is through evolution. And so these are our pieces of evidence for evolution. Catch you next time.